Hi, everybody. Welcome. We're going to get started here in just a second. My name is Melissa, and I have my teammate Kristen here. We're from Conservation Nebraska. Thank you all for coming out. We do have some friends online too. Thank you for joining us. We have a camera pointed at us here in case you're wondering, like, why is she, waving at this laptop? We're doing this virtual and hybrid tonight. So we have a couple of presenters here. We're going to go through all the presentations, and at the end, we'll have some time for some questions and answers session. So that's what those little notebooks are for those of you in the room. Feel free to write down any questions you might have along the way. And then at the end, we'll make sure to address any of those with our presenters here. I have John Hay, who is from the University of Nebraska Extension Office. He'll start off this evening with talking about agrivoltaics and ecovoltaics, a little about just what it is and how that works. And then I have Dr. Judy Smart here. She's in the back of the room. She'll be on camera in a little bit. And Paige Myers. So they are from the UNL Bee Lab, and they're talking to us tonight about pollinators and the need for pollinator habitat. And then Pete Berthelsen is on the line virtually. So Pete will be up on the screen here in just a little bit doing his presentation. Thank you for joining us. He's with Conservation Blueprint. I'll let each of the speakers maybe do a slight introduction at the very beginning of their presentations about a little bit of their background, what they do as they kind of get into it, because they can do that justice. But I'll hand it off to John. He's going to get it started here. Thank you for tuning in, and thank you for being here.
Great. Thanks for coming, everybody. My name is John Hay. I am in the Biological Systems Engineering Department at the university, but I do most of my work as outreach for the public. So I teach about energy issues, and that is quite diverse. That could be about large-scale wind and solar and the research that relates to that. It could be about small-scale wind and solar, more solar at people's homes and businesses, and what are the economics of that. I do a lot of modeling to get that information. And I do also some, ag energy management kind of work, trying to help people save on energy things. So really energy in all sorts. And so although this project and this particular subject is about solar, really this is, about this kind of confluence between solar and agriculture and kind of what's interesting out there. So, it may not be that I'm not necessarily here to promote the solar per se, but I am here to say, look at what can happen and what opportunities there might be if and when one comes in and is located. And so that's whether one locates in a particular place, the county zoning and all those have to deal with all that sort of stuff. So I'm going to give a little bit of an introduction to some terminology that I think will help kind of frame this topic that we're talking about tonight. And so I'm talking about agrivoltaics. Let's see if I can get this to work here. And I'm going to do just part of my presentation, but kind of setting the stage is that there are a lot of solar projects proposed in the state of Nebraska, and there's a lot more than what I'm representing here. But what is represented here are some dots on the map that show solar and solar hybrid. Solar hybrid would mean that they're planting that a battery at that location in the state that have worked their way up the levels of steps in the process to where they have applied to the Southwest Power Pool for interconnection. So that's pretty serious, right? There's actually probably a number of projects that haven't gotten to that level. So we could probably double the number of projects proposed in Nebraska if we include ones that haven't submitted to the Southwest Power Pool. These have, and I made that from megawatts to acres because that helps us maybe envision this just a little bit, 22,000 acres. Does that mean there's going to be 22,000 acres of projects built in the next couple of years? No. But the reality is having 22,000 acres of projects proposed and to this point in their process, some of these will get built, very likely. And there's a number of them down here in southeast Nebraska and a few other places. So we'll see how that goes. So these are proposed projects, and somebody is going to have to do the vegetation management under these projects if they get built. And that's some of what we're talking about. Like if they build a project, somebody's doing the vegetation management, and what can that look like? So here's some terminology to start with. Agrivoltaics, agriculture. Photovoltaics. Photovoltaics is solar electricity. Add those two together, we have agrivoltaics. It's a really popular word in the research field today. Also in the field of solar agrivoltaics is a very important word. I think it's a catch-all word for all sorts of these projects. There are some words maybe that are more descriptive. Ecovoltaics would be, planting native perennial plants and forbs and flowers that give some ecological value or some value to that, that maybe we're not doing agriculture, but we're having this ecological value to it. And so ecovoltaics. Now, some of these things can be combined. Solar grazing might be grazing sheep under the solar. And if we had an ecovoltaic situation where we planted some perennial plants and we grazed it, it's still ecovoltaics and it's solar grazing. And the same is true for solar honey. The solar honey is kind of just an advertising campaign, but it's this idea that what can we do with respect to bees or honeybees with that? So we have ecovoltaics that had some honey, so solar honey. Your computer has a mind of its own. I don't know either. Okay. Can't seem to stay on the slide. Okay, don't touch anything. There is no definition of agrivoltaics that is accepted by everyone at this time. It's not just something that everything, but there is one group called the American Farmland Trust that has created a definition. I'm using theirs not necessarily to say that theirs is the only one out there or the best one out there, but it is one that we can look to, and they're trying to build steam and try to get it approved. Again, it's producing a marketable ag product through the full life of the solar array. And I think the full life is important because if we think about doing that vegetation management, if we fall back and just mow it, that's not agrivoltaics, right? Because it's mowing it. Now, there's nothing necessarily inherently wrong with mowing it. I don't want to get that because that would be, we got to manage that vegetation somehow. But it would be maybe the lowest quality thing we could do, right? It doesn't have any other value, it just costs. And so that's where these other things have value. They really want to work toward an intentional design where the solar is built with the farmer in mind. And I think that that's a good goal, but I think that's where some of the challenge comes. And I think they want to see ag production across the whole solar array, not just, oh, well, we put, 100 square feet over here to strawberries and we're calling it agrivoltaics when we've got a 500 acre project or something like that. They want to see it across the whole thing and a lifetime. So when people think of agrivoltaics, this isn't a great picture up on the screen, but what we have here is on the left is an elevated area where you can actually run a combine under there. Here's one where they're elevated in space, so we got a lot of sun through them. Here's kind of similar to that one. And the next one, the last one, they're just vertical solar panels. That's cool. That's what people think agrivoltaics is. I'm going to argue that I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. I want it to happen in some ways, but I struggle to think about that. And I'll show you why, or I'll tell you why in just a second. What I think agrivoltaics is going to look like in the near term is the solar building on a piece of land with the optimizing the solar in mind, the solar production, because they can make tens, if not $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 per acre per year from the electricity. Now they spend a lot of money to build that, to get that, but if they're making $10,000, $20,000 per acre per year, do you think that they want to say, well, we'll just spread that out and make 5,000 less so we can make $500 on growing crops? It just doesn't make economic sense. So maximizing the solar is what's going to make economic sense, and then trying to say what agriculture fits within that maximized solar situation. I think that's where in the near term this agrivoltaics is going to take place. How do we do agriculture within the solar architecture? I'll call it architecture of the maximizing the solar production, and that could be sheep. I'm still hopeful that it could be cattle at some point, but it's sheep. They are doing that right now in many parts of the United States, including Nebraska. There's one facility southwest of Omaha that has 500 acres, and it has a contract, and the person with the vegetation management contract is using a mowing and sheep grazing program to keep the vegetation down. And so he's bringing in 1,500 sheep. So that'll be interesting to see. It'll be his second year next year. So I'm really thinking the sheep will be there most of this next summer. They were only there a little bit of last summer. Mowing is going to be probably a big part of any vegetation management plan, even with sheep, because number one, the sheep aren't perfect, but the other is to have the number of sheep to do that year round. You have enough sheep in May, but you have too many sheep in August for the vegetation that's out there. And so to manage that, a lot of the sheep producers that are grazing solar that I've met will do a little bit of supplemental mowing just to keep that down in the early part of the season. And then there's a really beautiful picture with flowers. I think that's a great picture, but I also think I've seen a lot of native plantings and in Nebraska, and they really look more like the one on the far right than the one with all the flowers. The one with all the flowers is beautiful, but it's maybe not realistic. If you can turn that light off, that'd be great. A little dark. I can't see you as well, but you can see the slides better.
Yeah. We'll keep it like that.
Yeah, so here we are arguing again here. Okay. I do think there's a future with high value crops. Here's my slide that I talked about the money a little bit, and I don't necessarily need it. These numbers aren't quite right. They're just my back the hand calculations, but even the back hand calculations can tell us that the profit per acre potential with the solar is far higher than with many regular crops. This is just where I want to introduce the architecture just a little bit. And on the right, fixed tilt systems were kind of the norm until about 15 years ago, and they were really common. What we've moved to in the large scale solar is a single axis tracker. And a single axis tracker will pivot on one pivot point and face east in the morning and west in the evening, and just recycle that every day so that it is seeing panels are facing the sun more often. The architecture is to drive I-beams in the ground and then mount the solar racking on the I-beams. I think that there's some good things related to this. One is that there's not a whole lot of concrete there, and thinking about if and when these come out 30 to 40 years from now, pulling those out of the ground is, feasible without leaving a whole lot of stuff in the ground or damaging the ground. And from even thinking about a mowing situation, which is not what we're talking about here today, but even thinking about mowing, that's been in perennials for the whole life of it, right? And so we're talking about, can we have that be better than that? And that's the hope. So they face east in the morning, and then they tilt through the day. And then the distance between posts is about 20 to 25 feet, giving about, enough room for a vehicle plus a little to drive down through the gap. That's great, but now thinking about trying to farm that. Right? That is a pretty challenging place to farm when you've got 15 feet and you just got to, and you can only really go one way. You can't turn around very easily. It's a challenge. They have done some successful versions of it, and I can talk about that. I just threw this picture in because it kind of gives us a little bit of that sense of what these look like with the shading. And so I will just stay with this one. Maybe I'll try to shorten my presentation up a little bit, but by saying the vegetation that grows under here in most of the research is 90% the same as outside of the solar array or better, up to 100, almost exactly the same. So there's some research. There is some research with some slight reductions, but what I would argue is that the amount of that percentage maybe is less important than, let's say if I was grazing sheep, what is my number of lambs per acre or pounds of lambs or rate of gain on that. And if that's the same, maybe that I'm down 5% on vegetation doesn't matter, right? Because it really is, what am I taking off there that's a value? And so there has been some studies that said, well, they saw some reduction in the vegetation, but when they actually measured the rate of gain and the pounds of lambs coming off on per acre basis, it was the same as grazing without it, or with the solar or without. So that was one point. The other thing I will then throw out is that if we're grazing this, one of the things that I hear people say, particularly the people with sheep that actually are doing it, they'll say, this is a ideal place for grazing. because the animals are never more than a few feet away from shade. And so that can be a very good place. So they are feeding, they move to shade, they're comfortable. So there's a lot of shade in this environment, and the animals tend to respond to that. I'm going to finish up with just a last slide or two here. This idea of vertical solar panels, or just think about almost like a fence. And bifacial means a solar panel can take the sunlight from either side of it, is interesting, and I think may gain some traction. I think if this was a situation where a farmer were going to own it and want to farm that as much as they possibly could, that's an option. But again, I think we have to balance where are we making the money, and if they're, and here's my argument for why I like the idea, but I'm challenged. The one-axis tracker, what I did is I modeled a one-axis tracker on one given day, and then I modeled a fixed tilt system on a given day and a vertical bifacial on a given day. And if the one-axis tracker was just made 100%, just for comparative reasons, the fixed tilt was 89 on that day, and the vertical bifacial was 67. So we're losing 33% of our solar production. And what are we gaining? We're gaining whatever ag value potentially we have, but now we're also farming in still a rough and challenging environment. Maybe a little bit easier than what we had before, but still not the best place to farm. So I think that there's kind of some of this interesting balance that we're going to have to figure out. 1 megawatt of solar is 5 to 7 acres. So if a project is proposed, if you see one and they say it's a 100 megawatt project, let's say, we could just say that times 5, it's about a 500 acre project, 5 to 700 acres. And that difference of 5 to 7 is a little bit of philosophy of some installers make a little bit wider, the fence a little bit farther away or something like that. So there's kind of a range of those, but it is really moving closer to 5. And just there's my data. And that's the end of what I wanted to present. I wanted just to introduce this idea of what is agrivoltaics, argue that I think that there's some really interesting potential, and this is why I think there's potential, is that farming in this environment is difficult, but you're not getting this land for free. You're being paid, and a fairly high rate, maybe in the range of $250 to $300 or more per acre per year to manage the vegetation. And so if you're doing ag on top of that, you have that income plus the ag income. And really, both parties are happy. The farmer might be happy because they got that extra income, plus they have access to the land, and the solar developer owner might be happy because maybe you were able to bid a bit lower for that project. So you bid 250 while the next highest bid might have been 300 or something. So they're able to pay a little less for that vegetation. And but I think what's also important, and I'll kind of finish with this, is that when I think about agrivoltaics, I am not thinking about agriculture on its own. I'm not thinking about photovoltaics on its own. I am thinking about not only them to the fact that this is a vegetation management for the solar array as a primary goal, and everything else becomes secondary, because as challenging as that sounds, because the company, that's what they're hiring this contract to be, is vegetation management. And that's what it is primarily. And if an ag project, and I think there's some opportunity for some businesses to maybe get into this, that could be some good income for the communities that host these solar arrays. And there will be some built over time. I don't know how many, but some will be. Okay.
Thank you, Don.
There we go.
Okay.
Sorry.
And then we've also seen that when you have diverse bee communities, the success of wild plants and then crop production also increases. It's loading.
Now click on this. Click on that once and then.
Okay.
Now you're back.
Okay. So we'll start with giving a brief overview of bee diversity. A lot of people have mostly had experience with honeybees or bumblebees, but we actually have over 20,000 species of bees worldwide, and that's about 4,000 species in North America. And then just here in Nebraska, we have about 400. And that includes solitary bees and social bees. And then they also have a variety of like nesting habits. So some nest in the ground, some will nest in plant stems. And we even have some kleptoparasitic bees, which those are bees that don't form their own nests and they actually will lay their eggs in other bees' nests. So there's a vast diversity of bees that we have out there. And so to clarify some terminology I might use, and to kind of classes of bees, we have what we call wild bees and managed bees. So wild bees include any bees that are not managed by humans. And so that includes native bees and then also bees that are introduced. So we have a couple examples. There's the sweat bee up there and the blue orchard bee. Those are both native. And we'd consider those wild bees, but we also have that European wool carder bee. And that bee would be a wild bee, but it's introduced and it's actually spreading pretty rapidly throughout urban settings. And so wild bees don't necessarily just mean native bees. We also have managed bees. These are bees that we use for specifically for crop pollination. And we can consider them livestock sometimes. These include one species of honeybee, at least here in the US is one species of honeybee. We also have one species of bumblebee out of the 49 wild that we have. And then blue orchard bees and some leafcutter bees can also be used as a managed species, but they're also really common as wild bees. So two other ways that we can classify bees are the differentiating between social bees and solitary. So the social bees will be the honeybees and the bumblebees that a lot of us are used to. These bees have many individuals in one nest. Sometimes, like with bumblebees, it's a couple hundred, and with honeybees, it can be 50,000. These bees have a division of labor, and they cooperatively care for their young. Compared to solitary bees, which it's just one female per nest, and usually it's just one generation per year. And then these solitary bees also make up over 75% of all bee species, which means that the social bees like honeybees and whatnot are kind of pretty abnormal in the bee world when we think of it. And the solitary bees are a lot more what you'll see out there. So getting into some of those bee nesting requirements, we also have other bees that nest in stems or cavities, and these bees need plants, like they need leaves, resin, or mud in order to make these nests. So they'll actually fill up like a stem they fill with a pollen ball, and then they'll lay their egg and they seal it up with leaves or mud. And then they'll fill up their whole stem like that, and that's how they nest. We also have bees that make their own cavities. So this is a little pebble bee nest. And so it's actually collected pebbles and used resin to hold them together. And that's where they'll lay their eggs. Along with the different nesting types, bees have different pollination methods. So some bees are highly dependent on specific plants. And that's actually there's not exact data on this, but it's about 20 to 45% of all bees specialize in certain types of pollen. And we call these oligolectic bees or specialist bees. Again, that means they only will forage from plants from like one family or genus. An example of this is the mock orange scissor bee that I have up there. And so those bees will usually only forage on the mock orange plant. And we can compare these to polyactic bees or generalist bees who will forage on anything. And that's like our honeybees, our bumblebees. But really the big takeaway from this is that a lot of times, if you don't have the host plant for a bee, you're not going to have a specialist bee that goes along with that plant. And so having a variety of plants can be important. Like I said, if you don't have the host plant, you don't have the specialist plant or the specialist bee, which can cause a decline. Sorry, let me reset. That's not the only thing causing a decline in bees. We have seen a decline in wild bees in the last several decades. Currently, in North America, about a quarter of our bumblebees are undergoing population decline. And even here, just in Nebraska, 6 bumblebee species have been labeled at risk and vulnerable. There's 3 examples of those that we have here in Nebraska. And then in 2017, so almost 10 years ago, a review was done that found that 58% of the bee species that they were able to get sufficient data on were vulnerable or in decline. And that was just what they were able to get data on. Many other bees don't have enough occurrences or like data points for us to be able to determine that. So that number could potentially be higher. But what is causing this decline? One of the factors that can be causing this decline is pesticides. Some classes of pesticides can be extremely harmful to pollinators. An example that I'll give is the neonicotinoids. Neonicotinoids are commonly applied on crops, either sprayed on them or used like straight to the soil. And so when it's applied to the soil, that can harm the ground nesting bees because that's where they live. And these neonicotinoids are not good for them. When they're in the soil, the pesticides can leach into groundwater, which then can have the potential to be uptaken by non-target plants. And it's been seen to show up in the nectar and pollen of some plants. And then drift from spraying and from the soil dust can also spread to non-target plants and then can even land on the bees themselves. And so when these bees are exposed to these pesticides, some of these effects could include reduced learning, poor brood health, temporary paralysis, and even death in some bees. So it's really not a pleasant time for them. And that bees face is climate change or extreme weather. So we've been seeing in the past couple of years earlier thaws, which then can lead to earlier spring blooms, which for the bees, this leads to a mismatch in their emergence and their bloom availability. So down there, an example is the mason bee, which isn't necessarily ligolectic, but it does have a preference for penstemon. And penstemon is one of those really early blooming flowers. And so if penstemon starts blooming early, but the mason bee doesn't come out at the same time, it lessens that window that they have available. So lessens the amount of food that they're then able to collect. An increase in severe storms and drought can also harm nesting and foraging grounds. It can flood out ground nesting bees. It can damage forage. And then increase in temperature has also been shown to increase bees' metabolism. And so the bees are hungrier, they're needing to consume more food, but things like the storms and droughts can be damaging that forage. Another of the big stressors that we see is habitat loss. The region of Nebraska that we're in is the historical region of the tall grass prairie, but we have less than 1% of that remaining here in Nebraska, which many bees do rely on native plants like that. And then about 90% of our state's land is used for agriculture, which is good. But for bees, a lot of times that can be a bit challenging. And then habitat fragmentation and loss has been shown to influence wild bee abundance and diversity, and can just make things generally difficult for them. So ways to help with some of those stressors that I mentioned is to use pesticides responsibly and only when needed, provide nesting habitat for wild bees. That can include things like wild bee hotels or leaving bare earth for the ground nesting bees. Also get involved with your community and educate yourself and others about pollinators. And then plant native vegetation, which is what can be done with agrivoltaics, like we discussed or mentioned earlier, and which is kind of the reason that we're here today. And then, so takeaways from my wild bee section before we get into Judy's honeybees. Wild bees are an important part of our ecosystem and economy. They're a diverse group of insects, but many of the wild bee species are in decline. And then ways that you can help with this decline are to provide forage for them, provide nesting habitat, and to use pesticides responsibly. Thank you for that. And then I'll give it to Judy.
Thanks, Paige. So I'm Judy Smart. I run the UNL Bee Lab. I've been out here since 2015. So my program is, my appointment is research and extension. So I spend a good portion of my time mostly engaging with beekeepers, landowners, and the general public, but there is a small component of my time that is dedicated to understanding what causes these bees to die or to struggle in the landscape. So Paige did a great job kind of exploring wild bees. There are a lot of similarities between wild bees and honeybees, and I'm going to go through honeybees a little bit in terms of where we are in the status of honeybees in the world and as well as in our state, because I know Auburn is really invested in honeybees. So these are a number of factors that can affect honeybee health, but for the majority of the green ones up top are going to affect both honeybees and wild bees. And that includes the nutrition aspect that Paige had mentioned, as well as the pesticides that she talked about. And this includes the chemicals that are coming from the landscape, as well as the chemicals that beekeepers have to apply to address the pests and disease issues that they also have to deal with. But most of the bottom ones are dealt with through management by the beekeeper. The green ones are kind of out of their control, but other people can help mitigate some of those challenges. One of the things that she touched on was climate change and the mismatching of these plants to the pollinator. But another really important thing about climate change is that it really does lend itself to giving pest insects more an advantage so they can reproduce and create more generations of brood. It also increases the rate of control issues. So some of these chemicals that are being used to control these pests are becoming less and less effective. And so what happens is that people will tend to spray more and more frequently or in combination. So climate change isn't just problems with weather, but also these more subtle effects and ultimate cascading effects that trigger human responses to deal with these problems to pest and disease outbreaks. I think it's not. What did you do to get it to work? It's got the little wheel thinking thing.
Let me see if I can just hook it up to the hotspot on my phone and see if that gives us better internet.
Well, as it's thinking, I'll just keep going. And, you know, in response to these increasing risk of pests and disease outbreaks, you know, we do see in landscapes where there are food deserts. Perfect, right, where herbicides are being used a lot to make these beautiful lawns very manicured. But that removes a lot of dandelions and trefoils and other clovers that might provide bees with food. The fungicides are also inhibiting some of their ability to absorb the pollen and the nutrients that they're getting from these food. It's also been shown that some of it can directly impact the developing baby bees, or what we call brood. So as we see these types of landscapes, the talks that we're giving are trying to encourage people to integrate flowers into those landscapes for more both ecological and environmental sustainability. Now, why we know this is important is because from the bee side of things, they are collecting anywhere from 6 to 30 different chemicals in their pollen loads and bringing that back into the hive. So they will carry honey in a honey stomach internally. Honeycomb. And this is a beautiful example of how vary the plant sources that these bees are getting. And that coloration, that pattern, is because they're getting it from a lot of different flowers. If you are looking at bees near corn and soy where there's nothing else, that pollen would be very white or very yellow and really one color. So it's a great indicator of pollen diversity. But another way to look at our landscape is that when we test the pollen for pesticides, this is a study that looked at a number of pesticides across the national sampling. But what turns out is that they tested for different compounds, and you'll notice that our state has a very dark color. And that indicates that the pollen sampled from our beehives in our state has pretty high pesticide prevalence, pretty high pesticide diversity, meaning that there's a lot of different chemicals being found, and it's pretty high in the concentration that they're finding it at. So it's not a great sign for us, particularly for bees, because there's a number of ways that chemicals can affect bees, from acute death to these chronic sublethal effects that basically change their behavior, development, reproduction, or alter the habitat in a way that they just don't survive as well. So there's a number of ways that can be affecting bees. I don't think this video is, I don't have a video here. So the video doesn't seem to be working. But I'll describe what the video would show. And then maybe when we post the video, I can give you guys a link to the video. But, and this is one of our example research hives. It's enclosed in a shed, so we can look at some very unique behaviors, but it also has an external entrance. So these bees are free foraging in and out. They're given a small sugar syrup with these neonicotinoid insecticides that Paige had mentioned in her talk. And in this video, you would see all these bees flying in and out, and then you'd pan over to another colony, and the bees are still alive, but they're just not moving. They're not really flying in and out. They're just on the hive. So a beekeeper going into their hive would look at that and not know anything was wrong, because their bees are actually alive. But what they're not doing is they're not collecting food. They're not caring for brood. They're not laying eggs. So there's a number of ways where a pesticide doesn't have to outright kill the bee to harm the colony, because some of these chemicals are affecting their communication, their locomotion, their activity, their cognitive processing. And so it's all of these things accumulate to the point where these colonies are unable to collect the stores they need for overwintering. They're unable to care for the brood that they need to remove the pests and diseases. What did you do last time? Did it just work all of a sudden?
Yeah, like it seems like the strength is going in and out on the internet, and like I came over there and it seemed to be get better.
Yeah, I would continue, but I don't remember what I have after this slide. All right. Any questions so far? Okay. Well, it looks like it's thinking.
This is pretty dire. Give us some good news.
Yeah, well, actually, it gets worse before we get good
Okay.
news.
Oh, yeah, there you go.
Yeah, well, I mean, there is good news in that a lot of the folks are now becoming more aware of the plight that bees are struggling with. And so we have wonderful communities like yours that are responding in, creating opportunities for the public to learn more about bees, to learn more about how we can promote honeybee colonies as well as culture production. Because I truly believe that we can do both, right? Honeybees are part of our livestock and agriculture system, but what we don't do enough is to talk about how they can work together. It's not a one way or another way. We're not saying that chemicals are completely bad and we can't use any of them. There is a way to kind of use them, conserve them, and help protect our crops, as well as try to maintain bee health at the same time. She's gonna magically touch the hot spot strength and figure this out.
I'm just gonna see if I can just.
Well, while she's working on that, have you guys heard about bee losses? How many of you heard about bee losses? Have you heard about the most recent bee loss? No. So you've heard of bee losses in general because the colony collapse disorder, it all started kind of early 2000s, right? You might be surprised bee loss rate that we've ever had over since this 14 years of monitoring. Continually to be on the wrong trend of having higher and higher and higher losses, unfortunately.
What's causing it?
There's a number of things that are causing it. Honestly, I think it does have, there are a number of circumstances that I think are inhibiting our ability to keep them healthy. One of which is the wild weather, right? That we're having these extreme up and downs, particularly this week is a perfect example. Last week we had snow on the ground. This next weekend, we're going to be up in the 50s and 60s, right? And so bees are not actually hibernating at this time of the year. They're not like what animals would. Their hives are regulating main have these warmths that extend maybe 10 to 12 days or 10 to 2 weeks. I'd say a week or 2 weeks, the queens start to signal that they are ready to start laying eggs and start to carry a brood. And so what happens is that when they are maintaining brood temperatures, that's about 90 degrees in the hive, as opposed to non-brood rearing temperatures, it's about 50 to 60 degrees in the hive. So it's a huge difference in the amount of energy needed to maintain babies, right? But they shouldn't be making babies in February. They should be making babies in the end of March. So that's an extra month and a half that they have to sustain high heat expenditures, which oftentimes they aren't able to do with the reserves and the ups and downs that keep dropping. So if it drops again and goes into freezing cold temperatures, then it's much harder to maintain those heat. So it continually deteriorates the population over the winter when you have these rear ups and downs. So climate is definitely, or weather is definitely a trigger, but these chemicals that we are using in the environment are also a huge factor. And just to kind of zoom out, this is from the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. They collect a lot of data from economics, marketing, trends, and all of this and pull together data across the continent. So this is the number of managed beehives over the years from 1960s to 2020 across all these different continents. North America is in green. Now, if you look at the projections of where we are going with managed hives from 2025 to 2034, you'll see that only one graph is going down, and that's North America. So the bee losses is not really a thing that you see reported in a lot of other countries. There are some areas where there are high abnormal losses, but it's not in this national level that we're experiencing. So if we break down North America colonies, this is Canada's in blue, Mexico's in orange. Only one line is going down, and that would be the US. So if we're looking, like I mentioned earlier, the loss rate from last winter was 55%. If you ask the commercial beekeepers, some of them were reporting losses as high as 65%. Can you imagine in any industry, if you're losing 65% of your cattle or sheep or swine, I mean, that would break your business, right? And this is year after year after year that they're sustaining these high losses. The only saving grace for beekeepers is that the remaining living colonies in the spring can literally be split in half or thirds to propagate another colony. You can't do that with cattle, but the beekeepers are having to stretch their colonies to really recover from those losses. And it's really not that keepers. I don't know why we designate ourselves, but there's this real designation. If you keep fewer than 50 colonies, you're a backyard beekeeper. If you keep 50 to 500, you're a sideliner. And so commercial beekeepers or anyone who carries 500 or more, some of them are running 20,000 colonies. So they're receiving their primary revenue from their operation. In our state alone, there was about 9,700 colonies reported loss over that last winter. Yeah, well, how many colonies do we have, and what's our beekeeping industry look like? Well, in the 90s, we had about 190 operations, and that has grown to 569 operations. So that's about a 200% increase. At the same time, though, we had about 49,000 hives and are now down to 16,000 hives. This is from the 5-year census survey data. So for more recent data on what we have in the state, last spring, we had about 24,000 colonies. On the purple graphs, that is just kind of showing the quarterly loss numbers, and it shows that January of 2023 and January of 2024, generally, we only lose about 1,000 hives. So this last year, losing 9,000 hives was significantly different and much, much higher than we're used to. Beekeepers say that mites is their #1 challenge, but second to that is poor nutrition in landscapes, as well as their pesticide exposure concerns. So one of the things that we like to encourage people to think about is it is really about proper nutrition. It's key. If they have an abundant source and diverse source of forage, they can ward off diseases, they can better protect against these pests and pathogens, and they have more resources to help detoxify some of the toxins that they may come into contact with. Now, I had a former grad student, help pull up some of these numbers in the next few slides here, but we have about 49 million acres in Nebraska. 28 million is dedicated to corn and soy. 24 is pasture and rangeland, which includes some of these really wonderful key prairie regions that Paige was mentioning is great habitat for our wild bees. But amongst the most commonly grown crops, it's mostly corn and soy dominated. We have millions of acres planted, but dry edible beans and alfalfa is one of those crops that has a lot of potential to be helping bees because they're partially bee friendly depending on when it's harvested and how it's harvested. Now, specialty crops, these are the crops that are often defined as fruits, vegetables, tree nuts, dry fruits, horticulture, and honey. Now, this is a huge sector. The Nebraska's #1 ranked specialty crops include popcorn, sugar beets, peas, and potatoes. This is the fastest growing sector in our state, the specialty crops in the farmers markets area, including organic growth, because there's a lot of demand for local food and organic foods. So this is something that we haven't been really taking advantage of, but is a growing market. It's driven by consumers. And even some of these food surveys show that consumers are willing to buy and pay more money for locally grown organic foods. So 91% of our state is all ag, and most of that is corn and soy and pasture. So unfortunately, we have very little habitat that is available for both our honeybees and our wild bee systems. And this is why the floral provisioning, the cover cropping systems, building habitat is such a really, I think, for us. Unfortunately, cover crops, there's only about a 4% adoption rate. That's really low. And part of the reason why is that there's a lot of upfront costs, there's a lot of complexity, and you really can't beat some of the subsidies that are being offered right now. When you're talking about these conservation programs, the Environmental Quality Incentive Program, EQIP, which are contracts through USDA and RCS, they can range anywhere from 1 to 10 years. There's 1-year grants, there's 5-year grants, but it covers a good majority, or at least 60 or 80% of the establishment costs. It still only pays about $20 to $34 an acre, depending on what species you're growing in those. Right now, at least as of last year, we have 550,000 acres under equip. This was really kind of low to me. I thought this is kind of strange. So I started digging around, trying to figure out why this is. Just as a comparison, the corn subsidy pays $42 per acre, and it's expected to rise as high as $60. So there's really no competition when you're getting corn subsidies 3 times higher than equip offers for cover crop payments. But surprisingly, if you look at the old articles of Crop Watch in 2007, they were paying $30 to $70 per acre for equip. And they said that there was 5.9 million acres under contract in Nebraska. That was only 20 years ago. But this is before corn subsidies came in play into Farm Bill. So this is before a lot of it got shifted. So you can see how quickly that has changed. But I am really optimistic because I see a lot of renewed interest in agrivoltaics, planting, not just crops, but also wildflowers. There's a lot of interest in the grazing, like John had said earlier. These are really, really pretty images that we'd like to see all happen. But, Pete's going to go into the vegetation management plan, which is really, really important for these projects to be well-sustained and successful in terms of the vision for its ecological environmental benefits. So what you can do is help us change the perceptions. I really don't think that we need cosmetic pesticides, the ones that make things look pretty. If we really want to conserve chemical use for pests and disease outbreaks and for farmers and people who really have these really strong needs, then we have to kind of reduce our consumption of cosmetic chemicals. That really means talking to people, farmers, homeowners, applicators, spreading the word, making people that are your ally, advocating for policies and practices that are helpful. I really, really think that if we bring more people into the conversation, we can really start identifying the solutions. There are a lot of people who are seeing, oh, well, if we use this, if we use this cover crop or plant this seed, it will outcompete this weed that I always have problems with, right? And so there are these solutions that are really come out of conversations from farmers, from beekeepers that help us kind of refine the research so that we can show the data that this works. So the idea is not to kind of polarize and make people feel bad about chemical use, but to bring people into the discussion about our agricultural practices and what we can do better to make sure that we're doing things that will help sustain these practices for our children and their children. That's it. All right. I know oftentimes I went to a beekeeper talk and they said, well, you often give death talks because I talk a lot about the different ways that bees can die, and it can get a little depressing, but I think that there's a lot of opportunities and optimism behind that as well. Yeah. Questions?
Immediate questions, we can definitely address those too after Pete. As we have one more presenter.
You want to get that
He's gonna
switched?
join us virtually. He's out in Central Nebraska, so he.
Cross our fingers we don't lose him.
Yes, let's hope that everything stays.
Hi,
well
Pete.
for
Can
us.
you hear us?
Sure.
Yep, I'm gonna mute us, Pete, so then you can go ahead and you can share your screen. Are you able to share it on your?
I have shared my screen. Are you seeing it now? Seems like your internet connection is a little weak there.
Yes, we can see it. So hopefully it sticks with us and we won't have any problems.
Okay, are you ready? Okay. All right. This will be a shorter one here tonight, but I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the vegetation stuff. And just as an introduction, my name is Pete Berthelsen. I'm with Conservation Blueprint. I'm coming to you tonight from central Nebraska, where I'm a private landowner, have a farm ground and ranch. That's a little aerial view of our place. I'm a wildlife biologist that has spent my career working on designing, establishing, and managing high quality habitat, and Conservation Blueprint specializes in working with solar projects to deliver multiple environmental benefits. And just to kind of put that in perspective, last year we designed the vegetative cover on over 38,000 acres of solar projects across the country last year. Okay, so I'm gonna talk a little bit about how important the vegetative cover is, because when you listen to the previous speakers tonight, if you want to have pollinator value, if you want an area that benefits adjoining cropland, if you want an area that looks good in your community, if you want to have agrivoltaic benefits, it all comes down to what's planted on the site and then how it's managed. So step number one, and when I say this, you're going to think, well, yeah, there's no shock value in that. That makes sense. But very often it doesn't happen. Step number one is to actually sit down and think about and define what are the objectives that you want to get out of the project. That will drive everything about how the project is put together. And the project objectives can involve many things, but certainly they're going to involve, how do we make sure that the project is generating the maximum amount of energy? That's what the project is there for. But it also might have to take into consideration local permitting language. So that's where, when a project is going through the permitting process, your local boards are going to have language, or could have language, about what does the vegetation need to look like and how does it need to function. And then many solar developers, most of them that we work with, have a corporate sustainability goal where they're not just about generating power, but they want to be able to find a way to produce multiple environmental benefits. And that's kind of when our phone rings at Conservation Blueprint. Okay, so to make that happen, there has to be a plan. Now, on a solar site, there's a plan for how many pounds of torque you put on a nut on a bolt and how deep pilings go in the ground. There's a code and a plan for all of that. Similarly, there has to be a plan for how the vegetation is handled. And that's called a vegetation management plan. And a vegetation management plan should really include very prescriptive guidance about how you do all things, from preparing the site to planting it, to what do you plant, to how do you manage it, to go back to meet those project objectives. And there can be lots of things in there. Obviously, there'll be some sort of a seed mixture. What kind of vegetative cover are we going to have? There'll be guidance about how you can plant it, when can you plant it, all of those kinds of things. But then a good vegetation management plan should also track and monitor what's the work that's done on the site to establish it, to manage it, and that sort of thing. So it is the code for that project related to the vegetation. And I would submit to you that if there is not one, that is a big problem. So that's one thing that can be prescriptively required at your county level when a project is going through the permitting process. Okay, so if we look at a project like that, you can probably look at that and think, well, that looks pretty and I like that and I would like to have that. Well, this is from a smaller project, what we call community or distributed scale, 5 acres to 40 acres, something like that. And it is not at all uncommon that the lower edge of that panel is 36 inches off the ground. As somebody that designs seed mixtures, 36 inches gives me all kinds of opportunity to design habitat that can look like this. Most of what we work with is utility scale solar projects, say 300 acres to 3,000 acres in size. The big stuff, those are the things that we work with mostly. And the industry standard is that the lower panel height is about 20 inches off of the ground. Okay. That's really important to know. And it's pretty easy to understand the difference between 20 inches and 36 inches in a project that's 1,000 acres and having those panels higher is millions and millions and millions of dollars of steel on those I-beams to raise that higher. So 20 inches above the ground, like in this image right here, can present many, many challenges vegetatively. Because if we're designing a seed mixture for a project that has the lower panel 20 inches off of the ground, our goal would be to design a seed mixture that would never grow taller than 18 to 20 inches. There might be a good reason why you would want to mow the site, but shading on the panels is not an acceptable reason for mowing. It's not a cost-effective way to manage that project. So that's a very, very important consideration right there. You have to think about using plants that can tolerate shading, and all the other project objectives that would be designed at the very front, step number one of the project. So I'm going to move into another important consideration. So that section was figure out what the project objectives are, because that will influence your vegetative cover. The next one is the importance of site prep. And I'm going to give you a little bit of a story here. So virtually every utility scale solar project in the country is going on to former ag land. Okay. So consequently, we're very concerned about soil health. Soil health is very important. Will the solar project help, be neutral, or hurt the soil? What are different things that are going to happen? Vegetatively, it's really important to know that we're going to have some real significant considerations going on to former ag land. So here's the story that I want to tell you. I want to tell you about the world's longest experiment looking at weed seeds. And it's a study that was started in Michigan long time ago, over 120 years ago. An individual took seeds from weed samples, things that we're familiar with, and they put them with some soil into glass jars, and they buried them in the ground. And every 10, 15 years, they dig up a jar and they see, will any of those weed seeds still germinate and grow? And here's pigweed, here's mare's tail, some of the things that are in there. And after 126 years, those seeds still germinate and grow. The weeds that are common in agriculture are incredibly hard to deal with. And I'm going to give you a little bit more of a story about pigweed, the photo on the left here. This is a photo of my neighbor's field. 200 yards from where I'm sitting right now, neighbor number one has planted this field to corn, and neighbor number one, in preparation for planting, discs this field until it's like powder every year. And if you're looking at this thinking, what is this? This is a cornfield, and right here are actually the rows. There's so much pigweed in there that you can't hardly see the corn, right? Well, 20 yards away from this field is neighbor B, a different neighbor. And that landowner does no-till agriculture, and it was planted into corn. Literally no disking on the front end, and plants directly into that field. And this field, when you look at it a little bit closer, there's a little bit of pigweed, just a few plants in there, but for the most part, no weeds in there. Now remember, landowner A, right across 20 yards away from that, that's what that field looks like. This response that you're seeing in this field from pigweed is what you get when soils are disturbed. Okay. Well, on a solar site going onto former agricultural land, you're going to have all kinds of disturbance. So there's going to be an incredible weed response that you have to be prepared for. And this slide is in because I give this talk to projects all over the country. This map shows where pigweed is found in the country. And unless you're located in a couple of counties in Georgia, it's everywhere. So this is an example of where you have to have a plan, a vegetation management plan for how you're going to get your cover established and how you're going to manage it so that it doesn't become something that just explodes with weeds. One of the ways you do that is by thinking about what are you going to plant on there. So one of the points that I'll say is that what we plant on there has the opportunity to produce significant environmental benefits. We can positively impact soil health, the organic matter in there, carbon sequestration, habitat for pollinators, like we just heard in the last presentation, fixing nitrogen, reducing erosion, helping water percolate through the soil rather than running across the top of it. What we plant on the site can dictate all of these kinds of environmental benefits, but it has to follow a plan. So when we're requested to design a seed mixture, we ask lots of questions because we want to learn about what the project objectives are. What are the local county ordinance objectives? What do we have to think about? What do the neighbors want to see on this project? And there's all kinds of factors that go into determining what that seed mixture is and how it looks. And there's actually about 15 different factors that will go into designing that seed mixture. Here's just a couple of them. This is 10 of them that are in there, but there's about 15 or 16 different factors that will determine what the seed mixture is. Okay, so now just a couple of thoughts about establishing that cover. So now we've learned what the objectives are. We know that we're going to have a really significant weed problem. We've thought about what we want to plant on there. We've designed that seed mixture. Now, how do we go about establishing it to ensure that we're going to get that great outcome that we want? Well, one of the things is there's a lot of ways that it can be planted. You can use a broadcast seeder, agricultural seeders, hydro seeding, air seeders, all kinds of different ways. But number one, the best method is if we use a drill where we're actually placing the seed into the soil. Maximizes the seed germination, germinates the fastest, and will establish the fastest. So drill seeding is always important. Here's an example of a solar project that drill seeded the alley, the area they could get down, and then under the panels along these pilings, they broadcast seeded it. Broadcast seeding is much less efficient, slower to establish, and not as much of the seed germinates. You can look at this photo and you can see that there's incredibly different establishment rates Where they broadcast seeded it, that is going to allow weeds to come back in there. So thinking about how and when and where your seed mixture is planted is really important. So there's kind of two strategies. One is I'm going to plant it during or after construction. And if you do, you have to have some pretty small equipment to be able to get in there. Going backwards, you're probably going to get this kind of a result. Okay. That's during construction or after construction is completed. There's another option, a way, way better option, and that is where we go out and we plant the area to the final vegetative cover before any construction happens. And when you do, this is what it looks like right here, which is a much better establishment, and the weeds are already pretty much just basically under control here. So it's a much better strategy that can be put in. And then the other thing that a good plan will do is a good plan will tell you, here's when you can plant for this site, for this location, based on the different planting techniques. Not all planting techniques are the same. Not all planting techniques can be planted at the same time. So a vegetation management plan should really be very, very prescriptive and provide you with all of this kind of information. And the reason why there's different dates here is you need to think about what is the weather going to be if this says May 15th is the last day that you can plant this site with a drill. You have to think about what is the weather conditions going to be like 80 days after May 15th. And in Nebraska, good chance it's going to be hot and it's going to be dry. So we can't be planting then because the seeds could germinate. You get a young, fragile seedling and they get cooked when we don't get enough rain or things like that. So you have to have a really, really important plan. Couple of last thoughts. We've heard the conversation about agrivoltaics. The two most common ways that those factors are brought into solar is either sheep grazing or pollinator health. Cattle grazing is really not an option. Cattle like to rub on things, and for a solar panel that is 20 inches above the ground, that's not going to work. So sheep are used for grazing. When you see a picture of sheep grazing a solar site, you either see a picture like this, which is, in my opinion, you see two images. One, a picture like this, which is probably the day the sheep are put onto the place and they're frolicking and happy and everything looks good. Or you see something that looks like this, where it's been grazed down to looking like a billiard table. If one of your project's goals and objectives are to also have pollinator health and habitat benefits, the ability to graze with sheep and have those pollinator benefits is very, very hard to do because sheep graze very, very differently than cattle. Sheep tend to graze at the ground level, biting that plant at the ground level, where cattle tend to graze more from the top of the plant and work their way down. With cattle, it's not very hard to say, okay, that's enough grazing. Let's move them to another paddock or to another site. With sheep, it's really, really hard to do because the next thing you know, it looks more like the billiard table that I showed you. So there has to be a grazing management plan developed for the site, just like we have a vegetation management plan. How long are the sheep there? When do they arrive? How many different paddocks do you have set up? A grazing management plan will provide you with all that information. And if you don't have a grazing management plan, you will not have the pollinator health and habitat benefits, in my opinion. All right, I'm going to close by telling you about a program that works with solar from a nonprofit called the Bee and Butterfly Habitat Fund. You may not have heard of that group before, but they have a program called Solar Synergy that works with solar projects to deliver all of the objectives of the project and make sure that we're having multiple environmental benefits and pollinator health. And this program brings 4 key benefits to a solar site. One, it designs 2 different seed mixtures that are used on the site that provide pollinator health and habitat benefits. 2, the program monitors the carbon sequestration changes that occur on the site. 3, it monitors the pollinator habitat and the pollinator populations that occur on the site. And then number 4, it connects a commercial beekeeper to the site. If you have a smartphone and you're fast enough, you can scan this QR code and it'll take you to more information about that program. So if a solar project is being permitted and coming into your area, one of the things that you could do is raise your hand and say, will pollinator health and habitat benefits be part of this? And have you considered enrolling this site into the Solar Synergy program? I said that there's 2 seed mixtures designed on a site. Here's an actual site from Ohio. The way the 2 seed mixtures work is kind of the mauve or purple color on there is that array area seed mixture that does not grow taller than 18 to 20 inches. And the green area of the project, there are not panels. Could be inside the fence, could be outside the fence. And that's where a more traditional pollinator seed mixer is designed and established, where we don't have to worry about how tall it grows. So 2 seed mixtures to produce more environmental benefits. And the Bee and Butterfly Habitat Fund has research behind it that demonstrates how their seed mixtures produce greater pollinator value. If you look at the one on the right, research conducted by the U.S. Geological Survey, governmental agency that compared Bee and Butterfly Habitat Fund seed mixtures to everything else that was available on the landscape, found that their mixtures had twice as many flowers, attracted about 4 times the number of honeybees, and attracted 8 times the number of native bees of anything else that was available on the landscape. All right, and that's it. That's how you can contact me if you have any questions. I appreciate the opportunity to chat with folks tonight, and we'll be happy to hang around and take some questions.